Hi everyone, AP Bio. It's me, Mrs. Willis, and I'm here to talk to you about a big topic in Unit 4, which is cell communication. So we're going to start off with the basics and then move into the different types of communication that you will see a cell participate in for the survival of the organism. One of the questions you may be asking yourself is, why do cells talk, right? And the basic answer to that is that cells need to talk in order to coordinate their actions. And this holds true even with organisms, right? We need to communicate in order to coordinate our actions. And ultimately, we do this for survival. Cell communication has been going on for quite some time, even with the origins of the prokaryotes. And scientists have found that even those single-celled organisms, the prokaryotes, did communicate with each other. Yesterday, I had you watch a YouTube video on how and why bacteria talk. And one of the reasons that our presenter told us was that they can talk to each other, of course, for survival, but one of the things they do is they talk to each other when they're crowded. And they do this to shut off reproduction, because if it's crowded, that means they'll run out of resources really quickly if they continue to reproduce. That process is called quorum sensing. And we have seen cells continue to communicate through time. So this is definitely a process that has been conserved through evolution. There are three ways that cells can communicate with each other, and they are different based on the distance of communication. So number one, we have direct contact. So when cells are touching each other, that's direct contact communication. We also have local communication, which is where cells are very close and near one another. And then, of course, you have your long distance communication. So that's more of the signal transduction pathway, and we'll talk more about that on Thursday. An example of direct contact can be seen in plants. So when plant cells are touching each other in direct contact, they have these little channels between the cells called plasmodesmata. And what this allows is for materials to be exchanged between the plant cells, which aids in their communication. There's a couple of different pathways you can see in the picture there. There's through the cell and through the cytoplasm, but ultimately that space in between is called the plasmodesmata, and it allows for communication via direct contact by cells. Another example of direct contact can be seen in animal cells, specifically in the immune system response. So when you do have a pathogen that enters into your body, what you will see is this cell called a macrophage, or here in the picture you can see it as the antigen presenting cell. It will ingest the pathogen and break it up into little pieces. It will then present those pieces, which are called antigens, on the surface of its cell. And when they do that, the helper T cell will attach onto those antigens that are being presented by the cell. So because you can see that they are touching each other, this is an example of direct contact, but when they do touch each other, this does activate the immune response. So this helper T cell will then communicate instructions to B cells to make antibodies to fight off these antigens that have infected our body. An example of local regulation occurs in the nervous system. So in the nervous system, you have axons, which are the endpoint of the neuron, which is the nerve cell. And so in this picture here, you can see the axon terminal, the end of the axon, and then next to it, you have another neuron, specifically the dendrites of the neuron. Notice the space in between is called the synapse. And at the synapse, you see the release of chemical messengers from one neuron to the other. And these chemical messengers are called neurotransmitters. Now, you may be familiar with some of these very common neurotransmitters because they do pop up in everyday life. So there's some called serotonin or dopamine. In fact, a lot of drugs do interfere with your dopamine amounts and uptakes, and that contributes to different sensations that you feel throughout your nervous system. An example of long distance signaling is through the use of hormones. Now, hormones are created from the endocrine system. They're released from what are called endocrine glands, and they are put in the blood, and then they travel throughout the blood to reach the target cells. Now, because these are traveling long distances throughout the body, we consider this long distance signaling in the human body. In case you forgot what organs are in the endocrine system or the endocrine glands, here's a picture, both male and female, and the ones that we possess. So they're located throughout the body. Their whole purpose is to create hormones that regulate your systems of the body. We will talk more about positive and negative feedback and how they do that next week. The last example of long distance signaling that we'll talk more about on Thursday is called the signal transduction pathway. Now, in this pathway, what happens is a chemical, such as a hormone, was created by the endocrine system. That chemical, which we term a ligand, will bind onto a receptor. You can find these receptors, they're usually proteins embedded in the cell membrane of a cell. Once that ligand binds onto a receptor, the receptor will usually change shape. And once it changes shape, it will pass on a message to something that's in the cell. So those chemicals will pass on the message to something else. That's the transduction part of this pathway. And ultimately, it's going to lead to some sort of response from the cell. Okay, so that whole process right there is called the signal transduction pathway. Now, there are different receptors that we're going to talk about. There's the G protein receptor, and there's the tyrosine kinase receptor. And then, of course, there's different types of transduction. So we're going to get into phosphorylation. And then ultimately, though, you want that cell to do something, so there's going to be a response. And so again, we'll talk more about that on Thursday. All right, so that can kind of concludes the introduction to cell communication, and I will see you guys in a second.